You lost me for a second.
Hey, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Populist Patriot. Yes, we're back. Just been real busy with various activities and whatnot. With me today is Tina Trent, and let me read you a little introduction of Tina Trent. She was raised in an IBM family in Poughkeepsie, New York, but has traveled between Florida and Atlanta since 1983. She lobbies for crime victims and writes about the criminal justice system, leftist radicals, social movements, effective grassroots organizing, the journalism industry, and academia. Tina moved to Atlanta in 1988 when her car died on the downtown connector in the middle of the night. She spent some happy years in the convention industry doing honest work, loading trucks, laying carpet, and building trade show booths. Unfortunately, she then went to work full-time in social services, community organizing, left-wing nonprofit administration, and Democratic lobbying, an experience she describes as, quote, the reason I'm now a practicing Catholic and social conservative. And Tina Trent is a prolific writer and guest on various programs and publications. Her work appeared in Accuracy in Media, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, American Thinker, Front Page, PJ Media, Real Clear Politics, and the New English Review. She blogs about crime and politics at tinatrent.com, and she will be, I hope, a recurring guest on the Populist Patriot. Tina, off the introduction, she is, I guess you could call, not only disillusioned with the left, but disillusioned with Conservative Incorporated without sacrificing her conservative beliefs, a defector from Americans for Prosperity. So Tina is a political outlier like us here on the Populist Patriot. Well, with that introduction, welcome, Tina. Welcome back, I should say.
Thank you very much. I think a dissident from AFP is a really great way to describe me. I've never thought about it that way, but I was hired in 2012 by them in Florida to go around and give speeches about George Soros. At the same time, the Koch brothers were partnering with George Soros. The Koch brothers own AFP. They were both still alive then. And I quickly began to realize there was something very wrong with that organization. And they were, first of all, you don't take your best volunteers in a campaign cycle and have them do push-pull calls on economics as opposed to actually working on winning an election. And that was my first cue that there was something dirty in the water. Then I met, Slade O'Brien. I'm not ashamed to say his name. He's now the national organizer for AFP. I met several other AFP heads, and I began to realize these people were astroturfing the Tea Party in order to destroy it. And I had felt the Tea Party was one of the most promising, political movements I'd ever seen because it was so idiosyncratic. You had, I was in Florida, so it was all retired people. You had social workers who'd been in New York City in the projects for 50 years. You had professors. You had something that was completely the opposite of you had people who owned small businesses. You had a lot of people who did drywall or real estate who felt like they were being crushed by illegal immigration. You had a whole bunch of people who'd been farm workers, people from other countries who'd come here legally, who were now third-generation Americans, who were frustrated by illegal immigration, and so the Tea Party people I met were completely different from anybody you ever saw on Fox News or anybody you ever heard about in the media. These people were abusing the Tea Party members. They were not representing them.
And,
So
and let me ask a double-edged question because I think you gave a lot of valuable information that very few people have given. I actually had, he went far to the left, but a guy by the name of Seven Surak, who used to be a field organizer for Turning Point USA, which is another group here on this show that we
right.
oppose very much. Charlie Kirk is a corporate globalist. You look at his book, Turning Point, he makes that
Yep,
clear,
yeah.
and whatnot. But where was the disconnect? And let's, on cultural issues and economic issues, there was
Right.
this disconnect between the average Tea Partier versus the AFP sort of coctopus, as some on the left would call it. I think actually, ironically, I think it was Murray Rothbard, I think, who called
That's
it the
pretty funny.
coctopus.
I guess he was jealous.
Yeah, well, I'm not. We're not fans of Murray Rothbard on this show, both from economics and foreign policy views. Um, but where were there was there a disconnect on like economic beliefs? Like the Koch brothers and AFP officially, they don't like the public sector at all, even what I term the
No.
productive public sector. But here, the Tea Party, you have retired social workers from New York City who probably have very good pensions. They were beneficiaries of unions and stuff. You know,
Right.
these are people that are also socially concerned. Where was the disconnect? Did any of
Okay.
these people
Yeah.
notice what was going on here?
The disconnect for and when I say I can think of 3 or 4 social workers I met in Florida who were retired and had good pensions. You're right. Um, they were involved in the Tea Party because they felt both parties had failed the working class people, and they also, like I did, because I spent 20 years on and off doing social work in Atlanta, they felt as if a lot of what they had done was more harmful to the underclass than helpful. So they believed in strong families. They believed in changing social policies so that people would become more independent from the government. Union issues didn't come up that much, but a lot of the older people from New York City had been abused by abusive unions that were connected to the mob. And I had had the same experience in Atlanta working in the trade show industry. Managed to decertify that union, and the head of it went to prison for the rest of his life. But um, they were people who had really tried the left wing attempts to make society better for the poorest among them, and had come to the slow realization they were doing more harm than good. And I think that describes me too. I stayed a lot longer in the left than I did the right, though, because once I came over to the right, I took one look at the Republican Party. In Florida, absolutely, it wasn't as bad as in Georgia, where I now live. But in Georgia, I live in a county that is in a zip code, actually, not a county. We have like 159 counties, so I'm in like 3 counties, but I have one zip code. And we have the highest percentage of illegal immigrants in the country, and they're basically slave labor to the poultry industry. So, up here, the issues are different than in Florida, and the Tea Party was focusing, a lot less on economics because our state was being relatively well run by Governor Kemp, and we didn't have the number of retirees, so our economics were different. But we were focusing on the issues of illegal immigration and farms. I don't want to live in a slave state. I don't want to live in a state where people are living in the shadows, can't appeal to law enforcement, can't make a decent living. There's, all sorts of abuses. And that was mainly, I mainly blame that on Republicans in Georgia. And so I was a member of the Republican Party for a while I was also a very active member of Tea Parties up here. I ran as a Republican for a seat in the House, and I lost. But I can name, I mean, I've met some very, very decent Republicans up here, and I used to know some very, very decent Democrats who I've stayed in touch with. But neither party itself is in any way decent.
Yeah. Well, down
So
here in
that was the
Florida,
problem.
immigration, illegal and legal immigration is a huge issue too. You have a slave labor class. To the audience, I recommend a book called Tomato Land, which discusses in great detail the use and abuse of migrant labor, whether foreign or domestic here. The I call it the new sharecropper economy, which I am convinced that the private sector oligarchs and their so-called conservative puppets want the vast majority of Americans to go back to. Um, with that stated, I have seen firsthand some of the war within the Republican Party. I was involved, I've never told you this, I've never told the audience this. I was involved with a sort of a nationalist Republican candidate, Mike Lamar, for state Senate. And I will say elements of the Republican Party, like the Boca Raton Republican Club, there were some elements within it, led with Jack Fernari and others that really took a personal dislike towards Mike Lamar. He was very outspoken. He spoke against the employers of illegal or undocumented immigrant labor, as well as work visa labor. And he made enemies of the big business Republicans and the Tea Party establishment types too, as well. And I actually blogged on the website BizPack Review, of which Jack Fernari is an official in.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically told me, don't use BizPack as free campaign space. And and he's been involved and has a reputation, if you look at the local media down here, as a very, shall we say, sharp-elbowed political operator. I really don't get a very good vibe about him
The
when I saw.
Miami Herald, yeah, no, it's dreadful. The
Oh,
Tampa Bay
you
Times,
know Jack
the
Fernari, or you
Pointer
know the.
Institute. I mean, I was in Florida for long enough as a college student and also a journalist where I know these organizations and they're so dishonest. They really are. They're so dishonest, especially about issues of crime, which is my specialty.
Hmm.
Just concealing crime, blaming victims,
Yes.
celebrating criminals that, I can barely look past that. But I mean, Broward County is a place that's, where there's an enormous amount of crime and I mean, not to change the subject too much, but yeah, the problem becomes for both sides. I've met decent people on both sides of the aisle.
So
I've
have
met
I.
truly decent people on both sides of the aisle. I've met very few people who choose to join either because there's a difference between voting Democrat or voting Republican and joining the party. Most people would never think to join the Republican or the Democratic Party. Those that do, with some stellar exceptions, who I've come to respect immensely, are generally people who I don't trust. And the nice thing about the Tea Party when it was, before AFP and the Kochs got their claws into it, was that it was a genuinely grassroots movement. And one thing I want to bring up to ask you about, because you've made a transition also,
Hmm.
is, I mean, and we kind of transitioned past each other. I went from what used to be called a blue dog Democrat up here in Georgia. I worked with the police, I worked with prosecutors, I worked on, extending recidivist sentencing for violent offenders. I worked on the 80% rule in Florida and Georgia. I worked with Charlie Crist before he lost his bloody mind. you know, he
Mm-hmm.
used to be really good on crime and then he went nuts and said everyone, no one should be in prison. Um, and, uh, you know, I went from that to walking across to the Republicans briefly to seeing how much they were not, you know, and they had no, as you say, they had no interest in the working class, and they were being snowed, by mostly by very wealthy libertarians hiding behind Club for Growth. And then I just kept walking, and I actually went back to the old school movements like Eagle Forum and John Birch, because I really felt as if these people, and when I refer to John Birch, I refer to the elderly members of it who really had, I don't agree with all their ideas, but who really had ideas about keeping America American. I mean, that is the definition of populism. Nowadays, I mainly work with senior citizens who have lived their entire lives, and have not been involved in politics. And the big problem, I mean, they have all the right ideas, but the big problem is they don't know how dedicated, very ugly forces within professional politics are to misleading them and distorting their views and that sort of thing. So that was my march to the right, and you have a march that's a little bit different. I'd love to hear about it.
Well, it's kind of a long march, not to rip off Mao Zedong's phrase,
Yeah.
but it's been
So,
kind of a long march. I actually was a member of the John Birch Society when I was in undergraduate school, and that was the start of my disillusionment with the right. When I joined the Birch Society and started to read back issues of their old magazine, American Opinion, then New American, which still exists today, I learned of how major American corporations and Wall Street banks, many of them, were actively traded even in strategic goods with National Socialist Germany, Fascist Italy, the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, et cetera, the enemies of capitalism in the West. And their magazines also showed the massive contradiction between what the Republican presidents and politicians would say against communism versus what they would actually do policy-wise. And my biggest shock was learning that Ronald Reagan had a very schizophrenic policy towards communism. So did George Herbert Walker Bush, Richard Nixon, of whom I was an admirer of. So that started my disillusionment very slowly with the Republican Party. I read the works, the literature authored by Major Anatoly Golitsyn, who was of the KGB, who defected in 1961.
right.
And he made a very persuasive case that there was a controlled collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European Warsaw Pact. And as I started to do more independent research, I got hooked to the columns of the geopolitical analyst and frequent guest of this show, J.R. Nyquist, when he was writing for WorldNet Daily. And for Newsmax, I suddenly learned that the political right in office and in think tank land ignored the warnings of Golitsyn and Nyquist. Nyquist has been in some ways blackballed by the
And
right.
Herb Robertstein and Cliff Kincaid and people like that. I'm sorry to
Yes.
interrupt.
No, you're fine. And so, but the two biggest things that sealed the deal, maybe three things. Number one was the financial collapse of 2008, 2009. And I started to read the works by economists and seasoned observers like Don McIlvaney, Anthony Horrigan, William R. Hawkins, Pat Choate, Kevin Phillips. And these are not people of the left. And I started to read how the Reagan recovery was really not a recovery, that deregulation and free trade and open borders and union busting was actually accelerating the contradictions within capitalism. And I started to study what many of the CEOs actually said, including the ones of these supposedly patriotic companies that wrap
Right.
themselves up in the American flag. And I discovered
Walmart,
that these people,
yeah,
Walmart, all of them, the Coke
yeah,
Industries, et cetera, and that they were doing business with our enemies, that their beef against, quote, socialism, whatever the hell that means, is really they didn't want to contribute to the commons. It was really good old-fashioned greed and ideology.
right.
And that was very disillusioning because the Reagan-style conservatism, the three-legged stool model of fusionism, defended this kind of behavior and defended these values. Two, there was an article authored by Mary Elena Stewart, who ran as a Republican primary candidate in the U.S. Senate race in Florida, and she wrote an article which talked about how Governor Rick Scott and former President George W. Bush and Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, former governor, I should say, they had this conference in Dallas, Texas, which invited all these, quote, red Chinese, quote unquote, billionaires who are creatures of the party and the state in China.
Right.
You know that. And legitimizing communist Chinese investment, which is really economic conquest of the United States, essentially by communist China.
Right.
And that was horrifying because these were politicians that were extolled and considered Tea Party politicians. And to be honest, no disrespect, Tina, that really disillusioned me severely from the Tea Party. Thirdly, I worked for Congressman Allen West, along with many Americans, including Democrats and independents, and he had a lot of the right ideas. In fact, I've had a few brief conversations with him, and it seemed like he understood some of the issues that needed to be discussed about not taking deregulation too far. He said we can't have, to me personally, we can't have a free-for-all kind of economy, is his exact words, what he said in a high school gymnasium in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He talked about the need restoring Glass-Steagall, restoring manufacturing and tariffs and the threat of China and Russia. But what did he do? He joined with Obama in voting for the free trade treaties with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. And that free trade treaty chorus with South Korea would have provided benefits to North Korea, to the North Korea's sweatshop zone, the Kaesong zone. He voted for permanent normal trade relations with Vladimir Putin's Russia. And he also was for also these increased work visas too as well. And he didn't co-sponsor legislation to sign on to against anti-dumping duties against communist China's corporations. And he didn't he rejected, the Buy American provisions, in any of the stimulus legislation. He didn't sign on as a co-sponsor. So I looked at this. I looked at this, and there's a lot of other stories I could tell you with people, Adam Hasner and others. And, to tell you the truth, it just disillusioned me. Whereas I always oppose the hard, tanky Marxist, Leninist left and their fellow travelers and apologists because of their hypocrisy. They claim they're for peace and social justice, but whenever they come to power abroad, it's anything but that. So I saw on much of the right that you had this same level of hypocrisy. And then I started to do a lot of reflection on the three-legged stool. And as Michael Lind and Julius Krein pointed out in respective interviews and articles and books, how can you have a strong national security state when you're wedded to an economic model of globalism and hyper-capitalism and hyper-individualism? And how can you have strong nuclear families as well when you're, again, subjecting yourself to an economic model that thinks leverage buyouts and payday lenders and outsourcing are just natural market mechanisms that should never be tampered with? So I looked at that and I concluded that the political right was full of blank. And I met a lot of good people, whether I agree with them or not on the issues. These are good people, but these are often the activist types or just the voters. And I just decided that, look, I'm not going to get anywhere trying to convince people within the Republican Party, at least in Broward or Palm Beach County, of my views.
No, they're
So
retired
I
and
need to.
also, and they're pensioned and they're well off. I mean, we have to remember Florida is pensioned and well off.
Yes, and they forget, and I've seen these people, like Craig Henney. I was told by a radio host who I work with, who I became friends with down here in Florida. Um, and this is libertarian host Craig Henney. I don't know if you know the name. And he actually, I was told, benefited from unions back in the day. But
Mhm.
now he goes off on unions and, you know, and against working class people. He likes to pit the public workers versus the private workers, which was one of the things that was very disillusioning of the right. The right claims that they are against class warfare. But they're doing the same thing to get political gain and to confuse people's minds away from what I consider the real problem of the abuses and anti-Americanism of the private sector oligarch elite. And I think, you know, it forced me to really reconsider a lot of my positions. I didn't like the opportunistic God, guns, and gays issue. I think those culture war issues are tools of manipulation by the.
I think some of them are misrepresented in the media to a certain degree because, you know, if you do something like me, what I do, which is I look at crime, I'm not thinking about crime in terms of guns. I'm thinking about crime in terms of prosecutions, and so my larger disillusionment. I mean, I have a disillusionment with both parties at this point because the libertarians have basically taken over Republican positions. But, you know, 20 years ago, I could sit down with Republicans, we could build a DNA database, we could keep the most violent criminals in prison. And that's not true anymore because of libertarians. I would say that I'm equally disillusioned by both parties. I feel, you know, I spent almost 20 years on the left, so I have a lot more disillusionment with them because I just watched them lining their pockets with money that was supposed to be going to poor people, that was supposed to be, you know, supporting families. And I saw so much corruption and so much theft and so much abuse of funds in Atlanta that there was no way I could possibly be associated with these people. On the right, I didn't spend that much time there. I just kept moving. And I just decided that, you know, hopefully there'll be a 2.0 Tea Party where people have really, you know, been abused and have learned something about who is their friends and who are not their friends, and will be more effective the next time around, and much more appealing to a wider range of people. And I think that's where you are right now. I think that's where I am right now. We can disagree on different issues, but, you know, the people that I came to trust the most were the people who really believed in, you know, the people who are being so misrepresented by the media, who completely believed in an issue, who really, you know, had given their lives to being teachers and, you know, educators and so many social workers and teachers in the Tea Party. I can't describe. Um, they saw the writing on the wall before a lot of other people did in terms of the Marxist takeover of America, and that's where they went. But when they got to those meetings and they were a grassroots movement, everybody in the media, everybody in both parties, everybody in academia, everybody in industry, large industry, which came as a surprise to a lot of people, they were extremely dedicated to what you're describing, you know, globalism, multinationalism, disinterest in your own citizens, disinterest in your own country. And they just went to their meetings. I mean, they're mostly retired, and they learned a lot of bad lessons I mean, they learned they learned that they were hated. They lost an awful lot. Whether they'll come back or not is a question, but, you know, we need a different type of fusionism than the one that's being fantasized about by people at American Conservative and, God forbid, National Review, and which has done more harm to real conservatism than anybody, I think. That's a
I
different
would agree
discussion.
with you. I would
Yeah,
agree
I
with
think
you.
William Buckley caused 90% of these problems.
Yes.
And David French did the other 10%. But
What about your buddy who's originally from Texas and he's like now a has-been? Oh God, that one that said condemned the Rust Belt cities to die. Oh,
oh,
Williams,
what is
Kevin
his name?
Williamson.
Kevin Williamson. Oh yes, my
What
least
about your
favorite
buddy? That's
person
your
at
buddy.
National Review. How could I not how could I leave out Kevin Williamson, who's just just so filled with hate, but so respected because he hates the right people. And then you take someone like Jim Goad, who worked in a factory, was raised in a trailer park, had a meth problem, drank too much, wrote one of the greatest books about class in American history, and is reviled as a racist when he lived in Stone Mountain, Georgia for 20 years and was like the only white guy on his street and hung out with his neighbors. I think if you take Kevin Williamson on one side, that's the problem. Jim Goad being persecuted and silenced on the other side is the other problem. I mean, I think Redneck Manifesto is one of the best books ever written about contemporary politics. But if you even dare to own a copy, I wouldn't be surprised if someone came knocking at your door in a few years. We
Looks like
we
I
are.
need to get a copy of it. It looks like
You
it needs
really
to
do.
be.
He's hilarious. I mean, he writes for Tacky Mag now, which is completely unacceptable to
Yes.
99% of people. And I mean, that's probably primarily because, only because Tacky Tackadorus has a sort of flagrant European flavored anti-Semitism, which he jokes about, that he is, that doesn't exist in America. It's a very European thing. But he's found, I mean, Theodore Dalrymple writes for them, Ann Coulter writes for them. Some of my favorite writers write for them. They're not anti-Semites at all.
Right.
Dalrymple's Jewish. It's the old school European and British type of publication where people don't worry themselves all the time over a few ethnic slurs if they're getting out a lot of good material.
Well, also a number of people also on the left and right who are rejected by the establishment, they have no other place to go to. I mean, whether we like his views or not, Chris Hedges, he doesn't like going on RT in America. He does not. But he compared it to Václav Havel. He's like, yeah, going on Voice of America. He might have not agreed with Voice of America or liked it because Havel was a socialist. But he had to do what he had to do to get his message out. Because Hedges, when you really dig into it, he's kind of an iconoclast. He's kind of hard left, but not, because at the same breath, he will go against the utopians of the left. And he's actually addressed that in his work in Central America. And others will say that the revolutionaries of the left, and I saw them up close and personal, are the most, pretty much, he said they were disgusting and corrupt and violent and everything else. And in the same swing, he said he went to boarding school with all the corporate CEO and super wealthy types. And he said they're just as disgusting too. And I think in coalition building, and you've had some really, the last part of this multi-series show we're going to have between you and I, you said some very brilliant things in some private correspondence with me on coalition organizing. And let's have our conversation. If I had the money, I would create the most motley but not so motley coalition. And I think it has to it has to include, as you put, social conservatives as well as people that may not be social conservative or center left, different classes, different races, genders, etc. But there has to be unifying principles. And I think what you've said to me was quite persuasive about one of the things that connects us would be economic views, a sort of truly centrist economic views that rejects laissez-faire capitalism and globalism and quote free market fundamentalism on one side, but the other side, extreme forms of collectivism like fascist or communist that will make us wards of the state and slaves of the state, essentially, which we don't want. You and I know people from those types of countries or nations, and it ain't pretty. The other thing is also an adherence to the golden rule: treat others as you would want to be treated, and also an idea of nationalism. And I say the word nationalism instead of patriotism because patriotism is kind of this Velveeta cheese food kind of, wave the American flag and we're American. But do we actually consider ourselves our brothers and sisters and formulate and think of public policies that benefits us as a whole and not merely a collection of individuals? And that's my principle of radical civic nationalism, this idea of shared destiny. We are in this boat together. And I've met people across the spectrum that actually agree with me. I actually find the politically engaged but unaffiliated Democrats or part of the Democrats, and class plays a huge role in this. I'm sorry to sound like a Marxist, but it is what it is. Class plays a huge role in what I'm saying, with some exceptions. And it's irrespective of race. I mean,
I'll say one thing. I never.
So what is your response to this? I'd like you to elaborate.
I think the coalition. I think coalition building. It's very funny for me to use computer terms because I only vaguely understand them. But coalition building 1.0 for the Tea Party had some very impressive traits. I'm talking only at the local level. The people who became the spokespeople for it were almost exclusively grifters, liars, and criminals, but who were ripping off their own movement and making it look bad at the same time, which is an impressive sort of way to destroy a movement. I've seen as many good people on the right as on the left. I really have, but and people who just simply have pure intentions, and as long as they're aware enough that they're in a political environment, they could actually step outside of partisanship. And I think there's a substantial number of them. I think in a very, very strange way, the absolute weirdness of Donald Trump brought these people out to vote for him in 2016. I mean, no matter what he did when he was in office, I think the really important legacy he leaves is the legacy of teaching both parties that the people can still kick their butts. Because I met Democrats, I met people of all ethnicities, I met confused young people and confused older people and people who were very aware of what they were doing at his rallies. I went to many of them, and it's not a reflection on him as much as it's on these people. And those people are still out there. A lot of them became either disillusioned or incredibly intimidated in terms of keeping their jobs and being accepted by society if they continue to support Trump, because everything was thrown at the wall against these people. And they truly were ostracized, and many of them lost, family members, jobs, and educational opportunities because they supported him. So they retreated. But they're still out there, and they're still the same people they were in 2016 when they voted for Trump and they took a chance on somebody completely outside the system. Trump was the only person Club for Growth would not endorse. I think there were 11 or 12 Republican candidates. They endorsed and gave money to all of them except for Donald Trump.
Oh, I remember that because I followed that issue too. Could you explain, because there are a couple of questions and good points that you made. Let's start with the Club for Growth. We've covered them on this show.
Yeah.
We don't like the Club for Growth. I mean, yes, we are capitalists. We're supporters of capitalism, but you and I support a very different form of capitalism than the Club for Growth.
Yes.
What is the Club for Growth? Tell me about them. And then I wanted to pick up on, before we close, on some of your experiences with the left. I had some questions regarding that
Yeah.
as well. So what is the Club for Growth?
The Club for Growth is able to exist the way it exists because and for example, they're able to be a political entity that does not disclose its membership because they take advantage of certain U.S. tax laws. And so the Club for Growth, to put it in the simplest terms possible, is a door you have to walk through to get elected on the Republican side of things, but we know nothing. We cannot prove anything about them. We know it was started by the Kochs. We don't know who belongs to it. It's a tax code loophole. Like there's a loophole for a lot of nonprofit organizations on the left that do exactly the same thing, where if you have 10 people who each contribute $1 million to something, you don't have to report all sorts of things that other nonprofits have to report. So Club for Growth is a secret entity, and they have exactly the same entities on the left, where enormous amounts of money flow through nonprofits and PACs, where if you have enough extremely wealthy people contributing, someone like me cannot go on GuideStar, for example, which is the nonprofit. If you want to research nonprofits, you go to GuideStar, you log in. If you don't pay for it, you don't get all the information, but you get 4 years of their 990s. You get, a certain amount of information. These people have managed to use this loophole, which is one of the most toxic parts of our entire, tax system, and avoid disclosure. And so every single Republican in 2012 had to crawl on their knees to Club for Growth because, I mean, take Rubio and Cruz, for example. They were well known in their home states. They were well liked. The Koch brothers were both giving them national platforms. I like Cruz. I respect him greatly. He's lived a very moral life. I dislike Rubio a great deal. I think he's just Al Cardenas's bag boy, frankly. I mean, you live in South Florida, you might get that. Most people won't. He's just a very corrupt person and a very dishonest one. But both of them had to get on their knees and crawl through that door and make certain promises in the dark that they could not reveal to the rest of us, and came back out with money and a public platform and flights to every major city in the country, and endless resources in the swing states. And Trump managed to defeat all that completely by himself, which is really sort of extraordinary. I mean, like I said, Ted Cruz has done a lot of very moral things in his life. He held his family together. He adopted his sister's kids. I think he's the real deal as a person. But there was no way an obscure politician from Texas, who had never done anything to attract media attention before, was going to rise up to the level he rose up to without taking their money. And he came across as kind of smarmy and hyper intelligent, and probably would be a great person to have in the Supreme Court, in my opinion. But there was no way he was going to win that race. Rubio came across as much more, telegenic and attractive and everything, but he was just as corrupted by these people.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
so, but what can I find out about them? I personally am good at doing research on groups like this, and I can't find out anything because of those tax code loopholes.
yeah, and that's where there needs to be massive and radical reforms to the tax code to really reverse the so-called reforms that started in the 1980s and really go back to a tax code that rewards production over financial speculation, that taxes or discourages globalization. We need to make stock buybacks illegal. Yes, one time it was actually illegal till Ronald Reagan and John Shedd, as SEC commissioner, made it legal and whatnot. And these are the things that I researched that just horrified me. And of course, it just made me depart from the neoliberal right. I think where Tina and I agree is we like conservative goals. And I think there are people on
Yeah.
the center left. I've met Bernie supporters. I've met people. I actually get along with elements of the Bernie supporters than I do the neoliberal Reaganites, actually. The ones at least, because I've encountered ones that were anti-communist, a young couple that came in that had their Bernie shirts on. We were talking about communism. And I remember what the young lady said, boo, communism. You know, I think there is hope. I would like to see this sort of on economics that would be center left, but not radical anti-capitalist, and reasonably strong on national
Issue
security.
based. Yeah.
You know, like sort of like your Scoop Jackson Democrats, what Michael Lind is today.
What the
Although
Blue Dog Democrats were in essence in the States, you know.
yes, yes, and there were
It
Pew
was,
polls that were done in the South. You're probably familiar with them in the early 2000s, where the Blue Dog Democrats were very social democratic with a capitalist flavor on economics, but on social issues were very
very
little
sensitive.
social conservative. And
Yeah.
those are people that I can break bread with because at least intellectually they have an understanding of what creates stronger families. And I wasn't trying to insult social conservatives when I was saying the God, guns, and gays. That's
Yeah.
the strategy that was used in the 1980s. Kevin Phillips documents it very well. I think it might be in Boiling Point, where there were memos that said, basically, don't stress Reaganomics and trickle down economics, stress that we're social conservatives and play that up against the
Yeah.
left
And
as
it's always a
electoral
danger.
strategy.
It's
And
always a
that's,
danger that they back out. I mean,
yeah,
the social conservatives, the evangelicals in particular, back out of politics and just don't get involved because they're tired of being misrepresented by the media. And I spent a long road trip with somebody who had been raised evangelical, and he explained it to me in ways that I hadn't understood before, because being from New York and being raised Catholic, you know, I mean, there were Catholics, and then there were WASPs, and there were Jews, and I mean, that was pretty much the people that I knew growing up in an IBM town. Um, but so when I came to the South, you know, all of a sudden there's this huge new body of people who are actually a large body of people who are evangelicals, and they very frequently just kind of they start checking out of politics because they are so abused and so misrepresented that they don't vote. And this was a very big concern of this man's, and it took me years to understand in depth how concerning it was, that if you don't speak to people where they're coming from, you know, you lose them. And you know, I think that people need to. I learned how to organize on the left, and they're very good at it. But they did it for the wrong reasons. They did it in order to have, you know, a class of people who were dependent on the government and did not improve their own lives. I thought one of the most promising things I ever saw in the 90s was was Clinton and Gingrich coming together and working on welfare reform. And I was a Democratic lobbyist at the time, and I was thrilled by this because I'd been working in the projects in Atlanta, and I'd seen the horrific outcomes of multi-generational dependency that was just so toxic, and children were not being parented. They were basically feral, and there was crime, and there was abuse, and you know, and here come two guys who have something in common. Their dads were drunks who left them when they were very young. And, you know, I don't admire Gingrich and I don't admire Clinton, but I admired them working together on one thing that they understood very well, which was welfare has to come with a step out of welfare for the family. And the one mistake they made was they didn't include the men, the fathers. It was his mothers, and you know, and the fathers became this drifting group of people who were living with one mother of their children after another in Atlanta. And I was doing home visits, and you know, if we had included them in that welfare reform, they would have performed as well as the women did, because we got about 70% of women off welfare who were single mothers. And, you know, I worked directly with them, and they were it was a great reform. It was the Gingrich-Clinton welfare reform bill. And I was working as a Democratic lobbyist at the time, and every person in the coalition who were running organizations that I worked with were so angry about this that they would scream about it when they talked about it. Every single one of them were wealthy. They didn't live in neighborhoods like I lived in. They didn't know these people. They didn't see how well this worked. They hated it. And that may have been one of the biggest turning points for me to walk away from Democratic politics because, I mean, there wasn't much to offer on the Republican side for these people. I totally agree with that. But, you know, this was a bipartisan bill that seems to be hated by everybody except for me, Newt Gingrich, and Bill Clinton. You know, but it improved so many people's lives at the, you know, I would go from school district to school district, and with my city council representative, I would do outreach to people, and she's a hard leftist, and even then I wasn't, and it worked. It actually, I mean, there are some policies that work. We have to this time, instead of organizing a group that is based on ideology and abstractions, we've got to be based on a small set of laws that we want to see enforced. And that is the biggest problem with you know, the Tea Party failed because it was too obsessed with ideology.
Yes.
And wasn't paying enough attention to actual bills and laws.
Yes, exactly. And I think the ideology itself is flawed of the fusionism, which was birthed by the National Review crowd, Buckley, Frank Meyer, I believe, and others. I definitely agree with that. And there needs to be an ideological reawakening. With the evangelicals, I think they could become a respected force in mainstream, I think, in part if they dropped particularly in the leadership like Ralph Reed, the free market capitalist and globalist
I'm astonished they put him back in. I mean, he's here in Georgia. We graduated from the same graduate school.
They need to drop that. They need to drop
working with
that
the same
Bush
people in the
free
history
markets.
department. I mean, there are a lot of people I respect a great deal here in the evangelical movement who helped me greatly on my campaign, but they gave Ralph Reed a pass for all of his corruption and dysfunction and his, you know, I mean, his lobbying partners went to prison. He should have gone to prison too, frankly.
Yes,
and
I agree.
So I don't. And then you've got other people like and his name escapes me right now, but the editor of World Magazine, which is actually the biggest magazine in the world, who started out as an Orthodox Jew and became an evangelical Christian. And he's a very good writer. I think his views very much align with yours in some ways. But there's a hierarchy and obedience within that group where you either get all of them or you get none of them. I mean, that's just the way that it is. And you have to sit down at a table and get them to trust you because they have been so disabused in the media for so many decades that they just, you know, and popular culture and everything else, that they just don't trust outsiders as much.
Right. Well, I'm not hostile to evangelical Christians. I have several of them as friends, some who I met in college. I'm not hostile to them. They could live their lives, and it's not me to impose my culture, my views, my values on them. Yeah. I think there's actually some crossover in values, if anything, between me and evangelicals. And many good people of goodwill in that community, there's no doubt about it. But I think we have to look at what unites us, and I think one of the items is a shared destiny. Now, you've mentioned several things about the corruption of the organized left that you've encountered in your nonprofit work. Did you ever try to bring it up to them and say, guys, what
oh
are
my
you
doing?
God, what the hell are you doing?
In 1991, I was put on a grant through Vista. It was a volunteer in service to America, which is the Domestic Peace Corps. They now have other names for groups that are similar. I was at Vista, and my boss stole $105,000, like outright stole it from Health and Human Services. It was supposed to go for AIDS education. and for non-English, non-Spanish speaking populations. And he pocketed it. He did nothing, absolutely nothing with it. He asked me I was a grant writer. He asked me to send in the grant protocols at the end of the grants, the timeline, and just lie. I mean, he literally just asked me to lie. I went to Vista and I went to Health and Human Services, and I said, this guy stole this money. He didn't do any training to anybody. And the head of Vista in Atlanta told me that as a white person, I could not criticize him because he was black, and threw me out. He said, we will transfer you if you keep your mouth shut, which I said, I'll take a transfer, but I'm going to not keep my mouth shut. And that was the end of that conversation. And they transferred me to World Relief, which was a much better organization, with all of my colleagues, because this guy was just ripping off money, and he was making like $500,000-$600,000 a year and not doing any work. That was the first time I witnessed that. Then I had to work with Bill Campbell's administration. Bill Campbell, who went to prison, he was the mayor of Atlanta, and I saw a lot of corruption there. And again, was told several times that I could not be hired by them because I was white. They only hire blacks, and which is statistically overwhelmingly true. And I was given one grant where I was supposed to go around and find second-time juvenile offenders who were violent, find them somehow, and they would get paid to learn how to make rap videos. I mean, the things I saw on the left were so extreme that they almost sound comic, but they're very destructive to communities and cause an enormous amount of violence. Then when I was at the legislature, I saw, and I was working in pro-choice work actually, I put together a memo once, and it was about how, what third trimester abortion really looks like. And because Tom Price was actually lobbying against this bill, and he and I, stood up and testified. I told the truth about what it looks like, based on my interviews of clinic workers. And I also told the truth about the pill and how we don't know if it's an abortifacient or not, because there's no way to know whether, cells get implanted in the uterus or not. They've never figured that out if you're on the pill. So I just used the science. And Planned Parenthood called me up and said, you're taking all of that literature out of every legislator's office, and you're basically losing your job. There was on the left, it was not the sort of militancy or suffering that, you experienced in Cambodia or Vietnam or China or Russia. But I was purged, and I was also subjected to intensive re-education. I was at a conference in Denver once, and they decided I hadn't pronounced a Hispanic woman's name appropriately. So they stopped the conference. All the women of color had their own special meetings. They put me in the middle of a circle of chairs, and they read poems to me about how I was a racist, instead of doing the work we were supposed to be doing. I mean,
well, if they had state power, those people would purge you. I don't mean to. I apologize for interrupting, but I have to interject here. I will say that if they had state power, they would violently purge people. And as a reminder to the audience, I think another thing you and I would agree with is, even in the American context, and in my book, and in Trevor Loudon's works and your works and others, we've all exposed the far left in the United States. I don't want to generalize either, but you have would-be killers and authoritarians. You look at Lyndon LaRouche, you look at the Communist Party USA. These are people, Jim Jones, who was affiliated with the California hard left. They would violently they actually were involved in violent criminal behavior.
Yes.
And these
Russian
people,
Underground, the Black Liberation Army.
oh
Assata
yeah, I forgot
Shakur.
about those people.
And Assata
Some of
Shakur.
them are tenured professors in
Assata Shakur.
legislatures.
I've had more people tell me that they see more Assata Shakur posters on college campuses than they do of Che Guevara. She's the new Che Guevara.
Yeah, living in
She killed
Cuba.
a bunch of people, innocent people. She came to Atlanta and sent her guys out one night to murder the first white cop they saw. And, and he was 22, 23 years old, and, he was eating a sandwich in a car, and they blew his brains out about a block from where I lived in Atlanta for 20 years. But what I find, and this is a humorous note to end on, I mean, if you have a very dark sense of humor, is Ron Paul and Cynthia McKinney are names you probably know. I mean, yes. You obviously know who Ron Paul is.
Yes, and I know who Cynthia McKinney is.
You know who Cynthia McKinney is because, I mean, she was a state representative in Atlanta for a long time, and she's completely nuts. They teamed up with Thierry Meyssan from France, who is a radical Marxist, and Ron Paul represents himself as being a libertarian, so what the heck is he doing with those people, except that they do tours together in a bus. And so I think this is the greatest and maybe even the funniest example of how we can't trust the professional political classes or even the alternative, outside the box political classes. And the biggest mistake that our movements have made is trusting people like Rand Paul and Cynthia McKinney on the right and the left. I call any libertarian under the age of 40 a leftitarian for a good reason, and that's Ron Paul. These people want to open borders, empty prisons, legalize all drugs, including cocaine and prescription drugs that will kill millions of people.
And sell Iran uranium and nuclear technology because, hey, my freedom, it's freedom to do whatever I want with my money.
Right. Thierry Meyssan, who has sponsored their entire, this bus tour they take on every election season, is funded by the Iranians. So you have you have far left and far right people coming together, who still have a fairly substantial following, both of them. And Iran is paying for it. We have to get a lot smarter about these things.
Yes, and there needs to be, and this is where one of the many things I think we strongly agree with to conclude with people like Cliff Kincaid and Trevor Loudon, that kind of funding, we need to have a Homeland Security subcommittees in both houses of Congress that need to investigate this kind of thing. We do need to revive the activities of House Committee on American Activities. And I think we should have, and this is where a lot of the conservatives will disagree with me, we need to have a counter-propaganda agency that even the government having its own radio station and TV channel to publicize this, because you're not going to get it in the private media, and people need this alternative viewpoint. And the only way that's going to come from is people like us using state power. We're not going to get it from Koch brothers. We're not going to get it from, the billionaire class, because many of them are invested in doing business with these people. Jeff Nyquist had a conversation. He publicized this on an interview, and I added in my book, with one of the political counselors of a prominent billionaire. And they said they would not support his book, The Origins of the Fourth World War, and his book, because they want to do business with Russia and China, and that everything would be fine if we just had anti-missile defense, which we really don't have enough of, and everything will be fine. But the billionaires, by and large, want to invest, this is in the late 1990s, in crypto-communist Russia and openly communist China. And they said that him and Ladislav Bittman knew, this political counsel of the billionaire agreed with Jeff Nyquist that things really didn't change in Russia, that they're still aggressive, and they knew so that means the billionaires know what's going on. And to me, Another issue I have with conservatives is why give these people so-called free speech rights under Citizens United, which is one of the bones I have to pick with Cruz too, because he's an outspoken proponent of this kind of corruption. And there are things I like Cruz about. In my video on Rand Paul, I praised Ted Cruz for going against the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and I give him credit on that. But there are other things where Cruz enables this. And to conclude, the right wing in this country, the conservative movement, the Republican Party, in order to be an effective anti-communist, we have to get over this love affair with the employer class, with the 1% so-called. We have to stop kissing their butts and being sycophantic to them. And we have to look at the evidence as it exists. It's not because they have more things than you and I do. That's hardly the issue. The issue is their attitudes, how they make their money, and how they're using their money in our plutocratic political system to harm our national security. And we need to really question capitalism itself and its incarnation without throwing the baby without the bathwater. We don't want to throw away capitalism in its entirety, but the neoliberal market fundamentalist, Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises sort of uncontrolled corporate capitalism, we need to denounce that. We need to push the libertarians out, the Reagan free market types out, and we need to build from the ground up a new coalition. And I think that's one of the things I wish Donald Trump would have done. Donald Trump had the personality.
He got in and he did nothing. It's a real shame.
He was surrounded by Conservative Incorporated, and that was really one of the most original.
Well, let me say that this is my
I want you to conclude.
This is my last statement, okay?
Yep.
I spent many years going to Washington, D.C. a couple of times a year and dealing in close contact with Conservative Incorporated. And of course, I did the same thing in Florida with the Kochs. And I have to say that they have completely purged real conservatives from all of those nonprofits. They've purged them. They've replaced them with libertarians.
Oh, yes. And there's a case of Richard Fisher, for example, from the Heritage Foundation, when he spoke in the early 2000s against China's military buildup, and they needed to put China's membership in the World Trade Organization on hold. It was the Bush people, Elaine Chao, Hank Greenberg of AIG, and others that put the kibosh on him and basically destroyed his career. And I think.
And I know many people who've lost their jobs in the last 2 or 3 years. I'm not going to name them by name.
This is the one who is published, so I will mention his name.
This more people than you would imagine have been replaced by. They made a decision that they were. I just like overnight made a decision. American Enterprise Institute moved in their people to nonprofits that were truly, really vigilantly conservative. Including some pro-life groups, not the ones that I have the most respect for, and they took over completely and changed their agendas. And it's over now. I don't go to Washington anymore. There's nobody to go there for. There's no. I mean, that Conservatism Inc. Is gone. When it was actually a conservative movement that spread conservative ideas is gone completely.
Well, Tina, we're going to have many conversations about this. I wanted to thank you for your time this morning. It's been a fantastic interview. I hope you've been satisfied. I also hope equally the audience has been satisfied. On this show, we like to talk with and interview and have conversations with kind of iconoclastic figures. All who want the best for the country. Moving forward, let's have you on again soon, maybe during the week at some point, perhaps. And we'll just continue the conversation. Where can people find your work again?
I haven't been doing a lot of work lately. I'm trying to, I bought a tear down house and it's tearing me down. I'm nearly done with it. So tinatrent.com is my website, but I have not actually updated it for a long time. I also have to say that this last Supreme Court season, I lost about 30 years of the hardest work I've ever done. There was a decision, Concepcion versus the United States, where they gave judges back all the power that we had worked to actually, keep liberal justices from letting violent recidivist criminals go.
Mm.
So that was what my blog was about for a couple of decades, and I have to regroup before I get back to writing about it because this particular Supreme Court decision, with all of the left-wing DAs and judges we have now, has I mean, the statistics are clear. Murder rates are going up everywhere. San Francisco has lost 70% of its office occupancy. 70%.
Oh, it's a disaster out there.
Chicago, New York, I mean, Miami, Tampa, smaller cities are having the same problems in smaller ways. So at this point, I'm not blogging right now because I'm just so demoralized. I mean, once that decision came down, nobody paid any attention to it. But, I worked with police and prosecutors, real police and real prosecutors for decades, trying to see that the worst of the worst were put away. And it's over now. They can just all walk, and they're going to.
Well,
Oh.
on that note, the country is crumbling. We have to stay. It's all going to pot.
Luckily, I just learned how to use guns, so.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't discourage firearms ownership. I am a gun owner myself, so.
I live in the woods. I mean, I also have to try to shoot bears if they show up again in the garbage.
Well, it's always a good idea to be prepared as long as you're responsible and whatnot. It's always good to be prepared. I mean, we are within a large degree Second Amendment friendly on this show. So, but moving forward, thank you so much. Now I got to spend daddy-daughter time today.
You have a good time with that.
Yes, I will. And we'll be in touch. And
great to talk to
thank you.
Very
great talking with you.
Yeah,
this is great. And I will we'll be having you on again real soon.
Great. Thanks a lot, Nevin. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.